and welcome to the 6th episode of the 2nd season of the podcast series here on We Are Respectable Negroes, what we affectionately like to call WARN. I am Chauncey DeVega. You may recognize my voice from Ring of Fire Radio with Mike Papantonio, the Joshua Holland Alternate Radio Hour, Sirius XM Satellite Radio, the BBC, Tom Hartman, or the Ed Schultz Radio Show. The United States has a problem, one that is little discussed by the mainstream media. It's young white men are killing people in mass shootings at their jobs and schools. There have been dozens of these incidents in recent years. However, there has not been the much overused national conversation about mass shootings and gun violence as a type of public health crisis. Moreover, there especially has not been a conversation about mass shootings by young white men as a function of what I have come to describe as aggrieved white male entitlement syndrome. For the 6th episode in our podcast series this season, I was lucky to have the opportunity to talk with Professor Michael Kimmel. He is a nationally known scholar and activist who researches, writes, and teaches about issues related to masculinity and identity. Dr. Kimmel is a prolific author. He has written more than 20 books, including his newest work, Angry White Men. He has also lectured at over 300 colleges and universities and offered presentations at many of the world's leading corporations on engaging men in support of gender equality. In this conversation, Michael and I discuss masculinity, gun culture, angry white men, and the mass shooting phenomenon. This episode was recorded several weeks before the recent woman-hating and internalized white racism-fueled mass shooting by Elliot Rodger in California. The prescience of our conversation about masculinity and gun violence is disturbing. It is an eerie reminder of how common such incidents have become in the United States. Hello, Michael. On behalf of the listeners of the podcast series here on We Are Respectable Negroes, I just want to thank you for taking the time out of your very busy schedule to join us. And as a leading question, I always like our listeners to sort of have an opportunity to understand how life is a product of many accidents and sometimes many intentional decisions. You have a huge body of work on whiteness, white masculinity, and white identity politics, your new book, Angry White Men. So I was just curious as a beginning question for our conversation. How did your career take place? I mean, was it an intentional moment? Did you have a light bulb moment where you said, I want to sit down and I want to become a sociologist who writes about gender, race, and identity issues? Or did it grow out of activism, or was it just a pleasant surprise?
The shortest answer to that is to say it grew out of activism. I think most people who are, who work in this sort of what we might call counterintuitive place, white people who are anti-racist activists or men who are anti-sexist activists, I think we had some kind of moment where, at some point we had to sit up and take notice. And that's certainly my case. I don't think we planned for this. I think more, my career kind of found me. I didn't go looking for it. But, so I've often said that was the sort of the way I came into this work was through, a series of encounters with women who had sort of experiences in sexual assault or who were working in around violence against women. My experience was that I had really never taken it very seriously before, and I was kind of shocked at what I was learning and decided at some point that I've got to do something about it.
And how do you think, and I mean, that's a very common narrative, and a very true, and I'm just thinking about my own development in terms of thinking about these issues of gender especially. I'm a working class black kid. My father worked for a university as a janitor, and he always wanted me to go, and he always brought me to the library to have a job where I could keep my hands clean. So I naturally sort of gravitated to academia. I remember being in college with one of my favorite professors, and I said, well, maybe I can do this. I can read, and I can walk around on the stage and pontificate and be confident. And I was like, maybe I can do this. And, some days I think I do it better than others. But as you said, it's always fascinating to me how some folks have that intellectual awakening. And then they say, wow, I find this topic interesting. But they don't want to get their hands dirty to actually go out and work with the community or actually participate as activists. I mean, you said something interesting there about, as a man, thinking about masculinity and then making that leap of faith to say, you know what, women have something to teach me. And number two, that I can also participate in these conversations. Thinking about your career path, why do you think more men, and as you said, more white folks, don't make that next step? Is it just it's easier just to read about it as opposed to actually going out and do something? Is it just human laziness? Or is it fear and anxiety about saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing or not belonging in a community?
Well, I mean, first of all, I tend to think not as often in either ors, but in both ends. And I think clearly you've identified one of the dominant both ends. On the one hand, I think that these issues are, this is the kind of argument that I have been making for a long time. That is, that privilege is invisible to those who have it. So you spend a lot of time sort of having that sort of awful conversation where you have to try to prove to a white person that they actually have privilege, or you have to prove to a man that they actually have privilege because they don't feel very privileged at all. And so on the one hand, there's of course the idea that, we don't see it. But then there's the other part is when it's pointed out to us, I think we have very inauthentic conversations about race and gender in our society, because I think we know that we're supposed to say the right things, we know that we're supposed to be politically correct, and we all can mouth the platitudes, and then behind the scenes, I think a lot of people are really, really just uncomfortable with this, and they don't really know how. I mean, racism and sexism are so pervasive that they're almost invisible to us. I mean, case in point, someone like Donald Sterling, who keeps saying, well, no, my players love me, I'm not a racist. It's so pervasive. It's like the water that we're drinking. It doesn't look like it has a color. It doesn't feel like it has a flavor. It's just what is. And so we often feel that we're scared to death to talk about these kind of things because we'll be exposed, because invariably we're going to say something stupid. Both we're afraid that we're going to say something stupid and that we're going to be exposed for being a racist, and then we'll have to defend ourselves all the time, and that's really a drag. Or that we don't actually notice that there's anything to talk about. Everyone can talk about their marginalization, right? Mm-hmm. No problem. I'm black, I'm Jewish, a woman, I'm gay. Any of the people who could talk about marginalization, but it's really hard to occupy the center. It's like hard to be like, who's like the number one oppressor? Who wants to be that?
I mean, and that gets you to this question about pedagogy and teaching. Thinking about academics and others who think about this stuff for a living, and if they're lucky enough can get paid and, make a living doing this and talking about these issues of race, of power, of sexuality, of class, and so on. Do you think folks, again, looking, the last 20 or 30 years, from the 70s up to the present, do you think that academics and others who do this for a living are doing a very good job of translating what we know? It's not like Donald Rumsfeld said, all these unknown unknowns. And I always find myself saying to folks, we know a heck of a lot about social inequality. And we know a heck of a lot about sexism and about racism. We have actually empirical data. So we can say, sexism is not an opinion. Racism is not an opinion. Do you think it's just a failure of translation, or is it that in this post-civil rights moment, there's so much pushback against having an honest conversation about white supremacy, about sexism? We actually live in this perverse moment where you have white folks, according to public opinion data, actually believing they're oppressed. I mean, it boggles the mind. Is it a failure of communication, or is it that the cultural moment in the mass media don't want to have these conversations, or they just want to sort of obfuscate and they'd rather talk about, is Donald Sterling racist? Is Cleavon Bundy racist? Is American society racist? As opposed to saying we know it is racist and sexist. Now what do we do about it? I mean, is it our failing or is it someone else's?
Well, again, here's clearly another one of those both ends. I think that there was something. I think we weren't prepared for this, but I think something interesting happened in the Obama election. In that moment where people were talking about being post-racial, and and white people were congratulating themselves for having overcome racism because, after all, they voted for a black guy. So how could I vote for a black guy and still be racist? So we were letting ourselves off the hook in a way that was really quite interesting. And now we're in a position, it seems to me, where we have actually never witnessed such an outpouring of overt racism as we are witnessing now since the civil rights era. It's really quite amazing to see it. And I think that's part of what's going on, or at least a little bit of what's happening, is that fear that the conversation, it's not over, and we actually have to continue talking about it.
And that is a natural pivot to your work of masculinity and whiteness and white identity politics. So as I said, I'm reading your new book, Angry White Men, and I was just struck by some of the stories about anger, about hostility, about insecurity. So we have this dualism right now, and I think your book points to it brilliantly, and it also, again, complements some new data that we have about white folks feeling resentful and scared as the country supposedly transitions to a majority-minority country, which, I think is a specious claim. I think we have a lot of history about how whiteness transforms and evolves, that race is in formation. So I always sort of put an asterisk when folks say there's going to be a majority-minority country. I'm like, not in my lifetime. Whiteness doesn't work that way. But thinking about some of the folks you interviewed, I'm always struck, as I said, we have, tons of empirical data. We can do good ethnographies. We can watch documentaries. We can actually go out and talk to folk. and we understand what whiteness is in the abstract, masculinity is in the abstract. It's real. We breathe it. We understand it. But I'm always struck, as I said in reading your book, and when I encounter it in the classroom, this sort of, for lack of a better word, anger and fear when you start talking to some white folk, especially white men, about white privilege, and that you can say, okay, you are the most empowered and privileged group in the country in terms of looking at SES data, in terms of looking at resources, but simultaneously you deny that white privilege exists. And that's not to say that all white folk are rich, because, goodness, go to Appalachia. We know that's not true. We know the white middle class and working class is being devastated by globalization and neoliberalism and austerity. But in terms of thinking about the folks you met when you were doing your ethnography, which is, as I said, a great combination of good social science and journalism, why are they so angry, and what are they afraid of? Because they're not silencing themselves in terms of their hostility to Barack Obama. I mean, they're not hiding behind, the backstage racism. They're telling you what they actually think. Who are some of the folks you encountered, and what the heck are they afraid of?
Well, let me say it a slightly different way.
Oh, absolutely.
When I talked, in the book, I talked to two different groups of men who share the perception that you described earlier, the data that suggests that more white people think that they're the victims of racism than black people. I encountered two groups, and I want to make some comments about them, because I think that's kind of interesting. But the first group I encountered that made me want to write the book in the first place, I was on a TV show opposite four guys who I came to call angry white men, these were white guys who believed that they were the victims of reverse discrimination, also known as affirmative action. And they had these stories about how they were qualified for jobs and qualified for promotion. And one of them had said this line, which was the title of this particular show, which was "A Black Woman Stole My Job." And so when it was my turn to speak, after these guys had all said their thing about how they were qualified, I said, I have just one question for you about the title of the show, "A Black Woman Stole My Job." Actually, it's a question about one word in the title. I want to know about the word "my." Where did you get the idea it was your job? Because, why isn't the title of the show "A Black Woman Got the Job," without understanding men's sense of entitlement, we won't understand why so many of them are so angry at the idea of gender equality. Because we think equality is a zero-sum game. And if women win or minorities win, white people or men are going to lose. Now, that's the first thing. So we can't just talk about the sense of victimization among white people. It's victimization plus entitlement. Because that entitlement is what drives the Tea Party, for example. The line, "We have to take our country back." Well, exactly who are they taking it back from? I'll tell you who. You. They're taking it back from people like you who they believe have taken it away from them. So that's the first thing. And I went out, and here's the second point. I went out and interviewed neo-Nazis and white supremacists and white nationalists. And I got to tell you, they feel like they've been screwed by this system. They are white guys. They all feel like they bought into the system. They served in the military, many of them. They completely bought the American dream, and they feel like they've been screwed. And frankly, I think they're right. Now, that does not, here's what I would say. I would say to them, you feel like you've been screwed by the system, but you're delivering your mail to the wrong address. Do you think you think immigrants are responsible for climate change? You think feminist women are the ones who are issuing predatory loans? You think black people outsourced your job? Are you kidding? So my feeling is they are screwed. They are right to be angry, but they're angry at the wrong groups. They should be making common cause with other groups who are equally angry and finding out who the real sources of their unhappiness really are. That's a really different argument. I feel like if you go to these people and you say you're wrong to be angry, you have not been screwed, you're actually privileged, you've lost them before you found them.
And how do they respond to that sort of moment of, cognitive disconnect? Because I've chatted with some of these folks online and also in person, and they get the class element sometimes. But then when you make the very smart pivot to say, we're all in this together, and if you've been screwed, look at the history of this country, black and white folk, and black and brown and white and women and gays and lesbians, they've been triply and quadruply screwed. All right? Is it just that sort of the sense of, as Brother W.E.B. Du Bois famously said, the psychological wages of whiteness and white entitlement, that somehow that's all that they have is white skin privilege? So when you reach out and say, we got a heck of a lot in common, let's ally and fight the plutocrats. Let's talk about Bacon's rebellion and how race was used to divide and conquer people with common class interests. Is it just that psychological investment and they can't get past it?
Well, I think that there's a lot of interest play to keep us exactly in the place of seeing this entirely through race or gender or sexuality and not through the prism of class. In fact, now people who are seriously arguing that even mentioning the word class is class war. Mm-hmm. So what you do is you declare class war, make the rich richer, make the poor poorer, and then anybody who actually points that out, accuse them of class warfare.
Or accuse them of racism or other made-up fictions like reverse discrimination. I mean, you have a great story. You know, I was watching book notes. I don't know if you're aware of this. Yesterday, there's a new book the gentleman's been making his rounds. He was an African-American cop who infiltrated the KKK. Have you heard about him?
No,
Oh, he was in Colorado, and he basically, went online, and he started this. He saw something online about, join the KKK, and defend white America, and angry white men, all that good stuff. We're losing our country. So he basically goes and infiltrates the Klan by having one of his white colleagues pose as him. But he gave him his ID, his credit cards, because they're going to do a background check and all this good stuff. So I'm thinking about your great interview on C-SPAN, where you talked about, I believe it was a gun show, and how you made these contacts and reached out to these people. Can you share that anecdote? Because, it's just priceless, because in your position, as I said, I would be nervous. I'd be like, I'm going to go meet these folks who are dangerous, who could hurt me.
Yeah, I was nervous, and anybody listening to me, on your podcast will be able to hear that I don't sound like you would imagine Clivon might sound, and you would be rightly nervous to go up to these guys. But I felt like, I just asked innocently, and, I got on my sort of, college professor look. And I said, we're not going to agree about this. Just the setup was, I met a lot of the guys that I interviewed at gun shows, because always very often at gun shows there's a table outside the actual, place where they're selling all the guns, where there's all kinds of literature, and the literature is often from extreme right-wing groups and NRA sorts of groups and paramilitary groups and whatnot. And so I would just go up to these guys and I would talk to them about the pamphlets, and I'd say, is this your stuff? And occasionally some of them would say, yeah, who are you? And I would say, well, to be perfectly honest, I'm doing research on guys like you, and I don't understand it at all. I'm a New York Jewish sociologist, so how could I possibly understand the world that as you see it? But my job is, and I said, look, we're not going to agree, but I want to understand the world as you understand it. And here's the thing that's really interesting. Many of them, their major complaint is they are the forgotten Americans and no one's listening to them. And I said, well, I'm not going to agree with you, but I will listen. That's my job. I cannot possibly understand the world as you see it, so I want to try to understand it, so I'll need your help. And I got a surprisingly large number of guys who were willing to talk to me. So,
and, were they just wonderfully open? Was it the old story that you ask somebody a question and you're surprised, like they teach you in journalism school, that people will actually talk to you? Is it just they felt like they wanted a platform and they were somehow oppressed? How did they understand the world? Was it?
I don't want to romanticize it. Quite a few of them said they weren't interested in talking with me, but enough said that they would, that it was worth it.
You mentioned the gun show, and I had the great sociologist, American Studies scholar Richard Slotkin on, who's written about American gun culture. I asked this as a legitimate question. I'll ask it for you as well. Is it an old argument that's just passé now to suggest that there's something going on with masculinity and phallocentrism and white masculinity with these guns? So what is going on in those spaces where they're linking up guns to American identity, to whiteness, to masculinity, so we want our country back? Is it just, phallocentrism and symbolic politics? Is it some idea that power flows from the barrel of the gun? Do they feel that, is it just a hobby for some of them? I mean, what was it like being in those spaces?
Well, I have to say, I don't, I am the adult child of psychoanalysts, let me put it that way. So I tend not to see this as sort of phallic symbols and, the power of the impotence and all of that sort of stuff. I don't. I think it goes deep, but I think it goes differently deep. And I think the way it goes deep is that this is the way America was founded. It was through the barrel of a gun against the British, against the native populations. This is how American white men sort of settled the country, appropriated the land, settled the land, took it away from other people. This is our heritage. This is how it's, in some ways there's nothing more American than a gun. Mm-hmm. And so I don't think it's phallic. I mean, surely, it's not entirely wrong. There are ways in which brandishing a gun and the power of the gun is sort of about respect power. It's about the power for me to do what I want with you. All of those sorts of things, all true. Inspiring, that my power inspires fear in my adversary. Yes, of course that has a kind of phallic component. But to me it's about gender more than it's about, sort of just symbolic, the symbolic phallus. I think it's really about gender. I think it's a way we prove our manhood. We prove our manhood in two ways. One, by subduing other men, and number two, it's really a variation of number one, by protecting women and children. And we protect them from them, and that means people who have arrived more recently than we did. We protect our people from them through violence. And so Slotkin is entirely right. It's the capacity for violence. It's that notion that he has that it's about regeneration, restoration, retrieval, that somehow it's been lost and it has to be regained. That is a really important idea, I think, from him.
The other obvious element, too, we can't overlook, as you said, the gun is a tool for violence, power, and control, but also for, as you said, appropriating labor and controlling slaves. And I was thinking about, sort of a natural pivot here, thinking about, some of the horrible tragedies we've seen, from school shootings to the Boston bombings to all these right-wing domestic terrorism that we've seen in the age of Obama. And it's not new. We can go all the way back, as I said, under Clinton and probably even farther back than that. Why do you think there's so much resistance, especially among the right-wing media, but I don't want to let the mainstream quote-unquote media off the hook either, to the degree that's separable from one another, to even talking about, number one, the relationship between white masculinity and gun violence, and then marking the fact, again, racially marking the fact that there's something going on here with white suburban youth, especially with these mass shootings, because I've written about it, and I've never received more hate mail, I get a good share of it, than when I dared to suggest that we need to have a conversation about what's wrong with white men in terms of the fact that they're about 23% of the population, about 75% of the folks who commit mass shootings. But why do you think there's that much pushback when folks make a reasonable claim, or even talk about these right-wing militias and say, you know what, these are white men?
Right.
I mean, what's the anxiety? Is it about white privilege again? Is it that simple?
No, I don't think so at all. I don't think it's about white. Well, maybe it's the privilege of not seeing it, which is, of course, a privilege. Part of my being my white privilege, of course, is my ability to not see it. Anybody who suggests that this is not an issue ought to do a little thought experiment. Imagine if all the rampage school shooters in Paducah, Kentucky, and Moses Lake, Washington, and Littleton, Colorado, and Santee, California. Imagine if all of them were poor black girls in Philadelphia and Trenton and New York City and Chicago. Suddenly we'd be having a conversation about race and rampage shootings. Suddenly we'd be having a conversation about the culture of poverty and rampage shootings. And even we'd be having a conversation about gender and how these young girls are being misled by feminism to be as aggressive as boys. But the fact that they're all, and not 75%, way more than that, are middle-class white boys. Suddenly we don't see race or class or gender. So just to name the demography of it, just the fact of it, is already, it already gets under people's skin. And so what do you get in response to that? You can't brand all middle-class white boys. It's obviously that they're all mentally ill. Which of course they are. But it's not, it's like these arguments that, guns don't kill people, people kill people. Guns don't kill people, young white boys, first of all, young men and boys kill people. That's the overwhelming majority of of violence, of murders. In these rampage school shootings, it's also, yes, of course, it is young white males who have a history of mental illness that has gone undiagnosed and unnoticed for a really long time. And it's young boys and men who have a history of mental illness who also have access to assault weapons. This is not individual guys with revolvers walking into school going, you dissed me, bam. These are guys who have arsenals. Right? So it's, so we have to talk about not the pistols, the revolvers. We have to talk about automatic weapons and assault weapons and, the kinds of arms that these guys are coming into school with. And the last thing that I'll say about the rampage school shooters is since Columbine, virtually all of the rampage school shooters have also committed suicide at the end. And this is another Slotkin kind of point, which is this is not simply rampage school shootings. This is suicide by mass murder. like suicide by cop. These are guys who want to kill themselves. And they are so humiliated, so ashamed, so aggrieved that they have decided they're going to go out in a blaze of glory. And so they go into the school knowing they're going to die at the end. But they are going to die fabulously.
They're going to have the glamour, so they think, that cathartic moment and the attention.
That's right. And that's an important piece also, because these really are suicides.
Am I, again, overthinking it, trying to apply Occam's razor here? One of the concerns when these school shootings happen that just, again, befuddled me. Again, we think about the public discourse and how folks, the mainstream white media in particular don't want to have these conversations because they don't want to look in the mirror. Right? That's hard for anybody to do, right? It's much easier to marginalize those other people because they have, quote-unquote, bad culture than it is to say, wow, maybe there's something pathological going on in our own communities. But I would like to say, go back to Occam's razor. How come you don't have folks, when you have these moments, again, astutely presenting the information and logic claims that you are, and saying, you know what, this is race and masculinity, we'll put that aside. What about crude self-interest? We have folks in our communities who look like us, who are killing people who look like us. Let's have a real conversation about violence and young white men killing people. Is it, again, just a lack of, again, the leap of faith to even come up with a simple solution?
We just don't see that. We see the threat from them. Think of all of the different words we use. If I talk about, inner city violence, what's the color of that? If I talk about poverty in urban poverty, what's the color of that? And if I talk about, suburban families, what's the color of that?
Right.
To me, these are all codes, and that's why I think that's why we rarely have a very honest and authentic conversation about race, because it's all done in a kind of a coded language.
I mean, like you said, in that coded language, as I said, we can talk about coded appeals and dog whistles because it works that way too. As I said, you don't talk about, black and brown people, we talk about poor people. We can talk obviously about Lee Atwater and the Southern strategy, but it's beyond, just sort of thinking about quote-unquote normal politics. It's about identity politics too.
Yeah, race has always been a proxy for class for us, and it's how class inequality is so, I think, has become so extreme is precisely because we don't see it as a problem of class. As we see it as a problem of them, and by them, Chauncey, I mean you. White people see this as a problem of them, taking what we think is ours.
And that gets you right to the angry white men argument, right? Coming full circle again. Two, interrelated questions. So the first one would be if you were an advisor for Barack Obama, if you're an advisor for the Democrats or the Republicans or, some third party, how do you actually reach out to that cohort? I mean, are they actually worth reaching out to and saying, okay, how do we go and actually get these voters to come back to the Democratic Party? Or are they so wrapped up in, again, white identity politics and sort of right-wing populism that it really is wasted effort?
I'll tell you, I don't know the answer politically. I do sense this, though. I think populism is not a theory. Populism is an emotion. And that emotion is righteous outrage. And I think it has been stoked on the right for a really long time. But I'll remind you that American populism at the turn of the 20th century was a progressive movement. There were farmers and workers uniting in places like North and South Dakota, all across the Midwest. And yes, there was a viciously racist strain of populism that sort of permeated the South as well. I'm not saying, but I am saying that populism as a movement has been a very positive movement. Populism has fueled, the sort of leftist movements in Italy, in Spain, in France. It's an emotion. And the emotion, I think that these guys feel is the right emotion. It's just being directed in the wrong way. So I think what I would say is you got to have the conversation that is really scary to have, which is not about race, but about class. Mm-hmm. You keep sort of making the argument, I think, that the question of class war has been declared by the ultra-rich, by the 1%, by the 0.1%, and that this unites all the rest of us. And I think that the Obama administration is sort of doing something somewhat like that by constantly harping on the middle class.
So they're making the first forays hopefully, as I said, fingers crossed, into actually trying to shift the discourse to say, what do we have in common? Of course, we can have an hours-long conversation about Obama's relationship to Wall Street and neoliberalism and, what's really going on here. But the concluding question is, I said, I always like, folks to have something to walk away with. You travel the country and do a lot of activism and you give talks to college students and to young men in particular. In terms of thinking about this generation of young men, however you want to parse that, across the color line, we'll just say young men in quotation marks, what is their masculinity looking like as opposed to the masculinity of their fathers and grandfathers? Is masculinity in this country in crisis? Or is there a hopeful moment here where masculinity can evolve and transform itself into something more progressive?
I actually am very optimistic about this because I'll tell you what I hear from young men. First of all, they all assume that their wives are going to work outside the home, and they all assume that their wives are going to be equally committed to their careers, and so they are much more gender equal in that respect. Number two, they all want to be good fathers. They all expect to be good fathers. They're going to be better fathers than their own fathers were. And the third thing that makes me hopeful is all the young people I meet now, and this is not the case 25 years ago, all the young people I meet now are very, very adept at cross-sex friendships, very familiar with it, very comfortable with it. Well, I'm from the Harry Met Sally generation, and cross-sex friendships were a difficult thing to navigate initially. And I think that that's really hopeful because you make friends with your peers. You don't make friends with people who are your bosses or your servants. And I think young people are more comfortable with gender equality than they've ever been. So those are the reasons that I'm actually quite hopeful. So what I think is on the horizon, Chauncey, and this is, of course, the other half of your question, what's on the horizon is there's going to be a kind of clash between what young men actually feel in terms of their relationships, in terms of their relationship with their children, their relationship to their partners, compared to what they were taught they're supposed to feel. And so I think there's going to be a lot of pressure and a lot of tension moving in that direction. Really important one.
And that's just a brilliant way to conclude our conversation. The other asterisk there, too, is thinking about how are those dynamics going to be located in an era of diminishing job opportunities and a broken economy. So that's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out in terms of either an opportunity for young men to see women as their peers as they both struggle in this economy, or perhaps for some, these angry white men we're talking about, to become even more resentful as they see that they can't be the breadwinner. And all the things that they dreamed of being able to provide for their family is something that's simply not going to come to pass.
Conversation we're going to have at another time.
Absolutely. Okay, very good. As I said, on behalf of the listeners, I greatly appreciate it.
All right. Take care, Chauncey.